do you want to share your comments with the whole class? Is that okay?
Oh, only for one.
Okay.
Okay.
Hi.
Yeah.
We're going to start talking again as a group. And Jacob came to me during the break to speak about this photograph, and I just thought if you want to share with everyone, I think it's interesting.
I'd also wonder what everyone else might think.
So we kind of flew through these. Sorry, I was trying to get to
just looking at this image, it seems interesting, being from 2012, that there's this trend towards presenting the male figure as more feminine in the sense that power isn't conveyed through the physique, right? So here we see the male who seems to be the same size as the female, and yet what I found so interesting was that still, from my interpretation, my subjective interpretation, right, is that the position of the man is still above the female. And then how his gaze seems to be towards her eyes, whereas hers seems to be towards his Valentino. So yeah, I would wonder though, has anyone else found this trend lately, that we seem to be departing from this macho man? And
well, in this one too, it's like they have the same expression. You know, they just look like siblings or something. You know, like
what did
I
you
don't know.
know?
There's
If you go back just 1 second to the previous one too, I mean, I also wanted to think or comment about the thought that like she's giving him the orgasm with the perfume in a way, and it's obviously coming. It looks like it's coming from him, but it's coming from her, and then there's a sense of the classical Greek sculpture, I would say, a little bit referencing with the form, possibly, and then in the next one, even though she's in the dominant position, there's definitely a sense, like they're not looking at each other. Like,
Just cowgirl.
but has anyone noticed this trend?
I personally, right or wrongly, have always associated androgynousness of the models with fashion.
with fashion and
I'm
androgyny.
not entirely sure why. I mean, I think that sort of the macho aesthetic is maybe something specific to American culture, and the fashion industry obviously still being under the influence of European culture, obviously. They tend to think, I could be totally off base, I mean, I'm not European, but I tend to think that they have a different, ideal in terms of, male attraction.
But I think the perfumes, the male perfumes, for example, from my memory, usually the men are well-built males.
Right, well, they're marketing to men, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas, these are being marketed to both men and women in this case.
Yeah, and well, I think the androgyny thing is something that we're going to discuss. It's in several of our articles, and there are some visuals that we'll look at that touch on this. But why are 12-year-old prepubescent models so desirable in the fashion industry? And the fashion industry continues to claim that the thin, undeveloped model is the best way to present clothing for the forms of it, to be seen by the public, to be received and to be noticed. And that's why an obese woman, for example, even though we're going to touch on this aspect as well, with some gender and sexual issues, even though obesity, some people, the subjective of how it looks, the clothing doesn't look. You can't see the forms of the clothing as well as you can on whether it's a thin woman or a thin man or something like that. But advertisements and fashion runway are different, of course, as well. So, but okay. Well, thank you for your perspective. And anytime, I mean, I tried to really fly through those first slides because I feel like we should be discussing, and we're really going to be focusing on editorials and going more slowly over things that are more media related than just fashion as a general design area. So, but we still haven't discussed the Simmel. So. does anyone need a copy? I have one. I have mine I can share while we're discussing. And if you have access, obviously most of you have a computer, you can just go to our class blog, and it's on there as a PDF if you haven't read it. So if you just go to the fashionmediastudies.blogspot, on the right-hand side, it's the first article that says required articles, and you can look at the PDF while we are discussing it. Actually, I'm going to do that since you're using my printer copy. Okay, so if you want to just go to the first thing that says Simmel. Okay, just super quick. I am put at the end of the syllabus. I'm not going to go over them. A couple things that I found have been really helpful since I was at EGS to ask about any reading material, even if you've read it 5 times. And you know, I have read material before. I reread everything for this class, even though I've read it before, just because I believe that you can read material that you've read before that you think you know and get new experiences out of it, right? And learn from it still. And so I think that's super important. And these questions that I have in the back are really sort of critical thinking questions to ask about anything that passes in front of you. Because there's this tendency to show up and have people pass out things to you and just read it. And what's that? That's not how we should be reading. People they're dispersing values, they're dispersing ideas. And we should always be thinking for ourselves, what are we receiving, right, in anything? And so these questions are like, well, who's the author? You know, like, who's this person? What's their perspective? You know, do you know the author? Are you familiar with them and their subject matter? You should be asking that about everything you're reading. What was the context? Was there a war going on when this person was writing? Was it a moment of decadence? Was it, you know, the 1970s in New York? What was happening when this person was writing? These are things to be asking, right? What are the concepts this person's selling in this article or telling you about or trying to learn about themselves? And how would you summarize their point of view, and how can you combine this reading with visual examples with what we're doing for this class? So that's at the back of the syllabus, if you want to think further sort of critically about it. So let's just dive into Fashion by Georg Simmel, and I'll take any volunteers who can share with us what this is all about. Someone must have read it. I certainly hope so.
So this
okay.
1904, is it the date of his birth?
1904 is when this was written.
Okay.
And he is, who is he? Does anyone know who he is?
I don't.
Anyone? Bueller? He is a German sociologist specifically interested in Kant. Okay? So I don't want to have to tell you this stuff every time we go over a reading. You guys are total grown-ups, right? Like, you should be knowing this stuff when you come to class. And I don't know what the other people are expecting of you. But as I said, I'm not going to stand up here and just, like, tell you a bunch of ideas. You're going to discuss, right? And the readings are essential. So if you didn't read stuff for this afternoon, you better read it during lunch. Okay. Yes. So in the back, is it Ren?
Ren, yes.
Ren, can you tell us?
Yes. It talks about fashion as a class issue, very specifically.
Good. Okay.
And differentiation and homogeny within and outside of groups externally, and how those boundaries can be more amorphous with the idea and the consumption of fashion.
Okay.
And
not quite consumption. He doesn't quite get there.
Because
keep in mind 1904. Okay. And
well, what struck me most about it is both how relevant it is still, but how different I felt it was after reading it, that there is so much more flexibility in class representation now than there could possibly have been in 1904 economically.
Okay.
That's my take.
Okay, can you expand on that thought?
That in 1904, the classes were much more distinct. Now we have credit cards, for example, where we can fake being from a different class and appear from a class that we were not born into.
Okay.
So I think, although this translates 100 years in the future to now, there's a lot of things that I think are even more relevant, if you will, that we're more able to do with this stuff now.
Okay, so, I mean, and that has to do, that's why I like the context thing. Sorry, I'm not texting while I'm actually looking up the article on the blog, which any of you can do if you don't have it. Yes, the context, right? And that's why I pose those questions, right? Like, who's the author, when was it written, etc. So it's a good way to start thinking about it. In 1904, there were some things that were quite different. you still have the residue of the old way of people receiving servant clothes, of people, some of those habits still going on. And even though the arcades and even Sears Roebuck had a catalog, which even the most sort of working class, sort of ordinary people in the United States had access to order things, that still happened. So there was some consumption and there was some access by lower classes, but I would say yes, to some extent, because we're in an advanced stage of democratic capitalism where we have a lot of augmented needs, as I explained earlier. Yes, there is a greater saturation of fashion even at lower classes, and there is this idea. I'm not sure I agree with you that class deception is possible. I actually don't think it is, but I think that this is one of the deceptions of advanced capitalism, but I believe that there is the access to styles of clothing. Yes?
Well, sort of similar to class deception is the ability for higher classes to look like they're a lower class. So you have Steve Jobs before he passed away. He didn't dress up very dramatically. He didn't look like he was this, very rich man. He dressed very casually when he gave his speeches. So even if a member of the lower class is able to look like they are very affluent, the higher classes nowadays, in many regards, also look like they are not as affluent as they really are.
Yes.
Financially.
Well, there are two issues, right? There's slumming it, right, which is like sort of the sense in high fashion of mixing with low fashion, bringing it up. I mean, like in '91, Karl Lagerfeld did the Chanel collection, which was all of hip hop, which he sent out his models with like big chains and wearing kind of the sense of like a lower class style, bringing it up and mixing it up. But then there was an article written about 5 years ago, the Palo Alto effect, which has had on male fashion, in how business fashion now it's like suits and ties, like not so much when you have like, the multi-billion-dollar tech guy from California showing up to the meeting in t-shirts and Nikes. That's changing business fashion in a way. So, and there's a greater acceptance of that, for sure. So it's difficult. That's why I said I'm not sure about class deception, because it's, you see someone on a metro, you don't really know, I mean, to be honest, always by what someone's wearing, what's in their bank account. Those things don't necessarily tie together. And so in some ways in 1904, when you could see someone, you could tell. So that's a good point. I mean, you knew because there wasn't that same access. So I think you could tell maybe more obvious in some ways. But so, I mean, it's an interesting topic. Yes?
And that's a term in the fashion world, slumming it? No,
that would be not an official fashion. That's just that's just a term that people use. You don't do slumming it,
The only reason I asked is because when I was growing up, whenever a friend of mine's mom would say that we were going to go slum it with the people when we were actually hanging out with people from the higher class. So she was being sarcastic.
Were they parties? Oh, she was being sarcastic.
She was being, yeah, you're going to go slum it with those guys. So where it kind of brings me back where if people talk like that, that just seems unbelievably dismissive.
Yes. Well, it's a generalization. I mean, I think too, and this is key to the text, which I have some quotes, but I want you guys to bring the quotes out, is that this idea that clothes indicate group, whether it's a subculture or a class, right? That, if they're wearing that, they must be this, and you're going to be of this part, and you're going to, I don't know. So it's a generalization,
right.
Whether you're generalizing somebody of a class or you're generalizing a group, whatever. Because clothes are connected to identity expression and individualism, which is the kind of key idea that Simmel is getting at. But we're kind of getting into the deep part of the essay. He starts out, because he's a sociologist, talking about what at the beginning? I'm hoping some of you have read it.
Class distinction, is that right? Or is he talking about entry into social groups? I can't recall it.
He's talking about types of societies, okay? He's a sociologist. So he's looking at society types. And what are types of societies? What are some examples? Like urban would be a form of society, suburban, maybe primitive and rural, right? Different groups, sorry?
Monarchical.
Right, and there's government structures, political structures, different ways of defining groups, right? And so he says that as a sociologist, based on the groups that he studied, different types of groups, what group is it that has this curiosity of fashion? Do all groups have fashion? Does every group have fashion in the world?
No, class societies have fashion.
Specifically, as Ren mentioned, it's going to be a class society, meaning what types of fashion, or what type of groups don't have. He said, I'm sorry?
Classless society?
Classless or rural and primitive societies, right? So he makes that distinction up front as a sociologist. He says, this curious thing called fashion is a curious thing for us in this world of class societies. But if you can go forward one image. And I'm not sure I agree with him, and I want us to discuss this, right? He claims primitive societies, classless societies, they have clothes, but they don't have fashion. As a system of change in terms of having the newest thing, tasting styles, checking things out, trying things on. Yes?
Well, it's not even just that. It's primitive societies that are, they don't have fashion, but it would also then mean that capitalist societies that aren't capitalist societies don't have fashion or clothing like that.
Correct.
So he would sort of play off of, well, even in sort of a modern era, societies that aren't capitalist societies are somehow using this fashion and desire to have representation of clothing. So I think that is sort of an issue to take part in.
For sure. And so what would be an example?
Well, in Korea, I think it would be an example.
Okay.
There's a problem of Korean historians trying to identify when they have the emergence of capitalism in society in order to justify that they become this modern people. But you see instances of fashion, of ways of people dressing, in different colors representing different activities they might partake in, whether it's marriage or funeral, or different activities that they have, different jobs they have. So there's obviously ways of dressing that they had in society at that time, and it's difficult to call them primitive because they have all these different advances. Koreans were the first ones to develop tight print, even though Western societies claim that they were the ones that did it. So it's...
Yes. I completely agree. I think primitive was the word that he used in his
Right.
text, but I think that you're right in the sense that systems of ritual and tradition, right, are things, and he uses this term, which I'm just going to jump ahead because this is relevant. We'll come back. We will come back. Sorry, I'm going through a lot, but I think it's just important enough to discuss. Is this idea, it's on page 544, and it has to do with objectively determined subjects. And he doesn't talk about this a whole bunch, but he does describe it. And it's on the lower right-hand side of 544. And he says, fashion occasionally will accept objectively determined subjects, such as religious faith, scientific interest, even socialism and individualism. But it does not become operative as fashion until these subjects can be considered independent of deeper human motives, and he goes on and on. He basically says that fashion's okay with, if you do this because it's your tradition, for example, your marriage garment, which we have in the United States, a marriage garment, a wedding garment. If you do it because it's your profession, or you do it because it's your faith. Fashion just is kind of like, okay, all right, you can do those things, but it doesn't stop fashion. It doesn't even, and fashion just can kind of embrace it and say, we'll put it in an editorial, we'll accept it. And so in contemporary capitalist societies, or even, because I would argue, Korea being capitalist, you're in South Korea, yeah. So, these capitalist societies can run concurrent with ritual, with tradition, with objectively determined, as the author calls them, and it's kind of okay. But the distinction that, for fashion, I'm saying they're just kind of okay with it, the distinction that the author's trying to make, Simmel, at the very beginning, is about what he calls the primitive, or the sort of ones that only ever live in ritual and tradition. Like these groups that, esoteric places, Into the Clouds. Has anybody seen that? Barbara Schroeder, you should see it, it's pretty amazing. Into the Clouds, which is about New Zealand, actually, in Southeast Asia. But these areas where people are untouched, which is becoming more and more rare, is what he's talking about. Places where people not only are disconnected from consumption, but they're not even really ever thinking, wearing one garment all the time, perhaps, unless it is a wedding or it is something like that. So, I don't know. And then if you go forward, what's interesting too is you see a lot of this, which are editorials that kind of transform these things into costume in a way. And so this is actually contemporary designers, clothes by contemporary designers. Just the two, the four slides, or the four images. And then kind of, not in a mocking way, but in a representative way, embodying these objective personalities. And all of these images here are also from editorials. You know, a military uniform, it can be in a fashion magazine, so can a nun, you know, and sort of this idea of playing with identity. But someone had their hand raised. Oh, yes.
And we had talked about Mennonite culture,
Oh, Mennonites.
and not like bonnet Mennonites, but at my university, it's sort of contemporary Mennonite culture. But I have such trouble, like I feel like I never forget that phase. But in this culture, there's still the remnants of such like super plain dress and haircuts that I can't recognize people, you know, and they really are so, but they're not like farmer bonnets in the, you know, they're dressing fairly contemporarily, but in these ways that just have absolutely no distinction, and their haircuts are just, I don't know how they do it, actually. I don't know how they manage to, and it's not everybody, but there's a certain age group that is really not about fashion, and they find these perfect kind of boxy, you know, pieces of clothing to wear that have no color, but they're not black, you know, black. I mean, they just perfectly disappear, and I cannot recognize people. It's like a real problem in this culture.
Well, that's part of what Simmel talks about, specifically with what groups do, which is what? All groups.
Become like each other.
Assimilate?
Well, they demand imitation from all of the members of the group,
Yeah.
such as to relieve anyone of individual responsibility within the organization of a group.
Mm-hmm.
This is like the conclusion I think that Simmel really comes to.
Yes.
So.
But this imitation and the sense of imitation and the exact quote I have, now I have to jump back through all this. Excuse me. Sorry. Okay. So fashion represents, this is page 543, this is actually earlier, but he does reinforce it in the conclusion. Fashion represents nothing more than one of the many forms of life, by the aid of which we seek to combine in uniform spheres of activity the tendency towards social equalization with the desire for individual differentiation and change. And so if you think of the military, for example, just the military, you could say everyone's wearing a uniform, everyone looks the same. This is a great example of uniformity, everyone's on the same page, we're all on the same team. But within the military, how many bars do you have? Oh, do you have a star? Well, do you have this hat? Wait, what about that decoration? So there's a sense of uniformity, and there are subtle codes of differentiation and distinction, right? So that's extremely important, and that's how he believes as a sociologist that groups work. Groups work as fashion. I mean, can you imagine if I came in a ball gown to this class? I mean, yes, you can imagine. It might be interesting, actually, maybe a performative fashion class. But we have a code here. We have weather to, you know, we're casual. We're kind of all like, you know, whatever we are, these like young contemporary thinkers that kind of, we are not, there's nobody in here wearing anything that I can see that's outside of the group clothing. No one, right? And so you might think it's hard to tell the Mennonites apart. Well, Mr. Zabrigan might actually think it's hard to tell us apart. They're all in jeans and t-shirts. Right? So,
right.
So it's, you know, and it's difficult sometimes to see maybe your own group. Okay, other parts of the reading, yes?
No, this is going forward, it's
Oh, yeah.
back a little
Okay.
bit. But that reminds me of the primitive societies, and he talks about I'll quote, fashion, conformity, imitation, social equalization, but he talks about how classic forms are immune to change. So within these cultures where we can differentiate, those become our classic forms.
Yes.
So in the primitive culture, I may not be able to tell the chief or the chief's wife from someone else, not to be stereotypical. And same in the military, I can't even maybe discern what a gold bar versus 4 black bars might mean. So those forms become the classic forms that are, you know, within contemporary fashion that we're talking about.
Right, and those are clothing codes versus fashion codes. That's usually the general way of talking about it. So a clothing code would be a suit, for example. And a fashion code might be the change of fashion. More like women's fashion is often more aligned in the fashion codes, where clothing codes are sweaters or suits. And I have some visuals of that as well. So, for example, if you look at the G20, here they are all in a row. It's like their high school photo, right? It's so funny. And what do we see here, clothing-wise?
Lots of suits.
Black suits. Right? So we get a lot of the sort of classic, the clothing code, the suit in the Western culture. What about what's depicted?
3 women wearing color.
Okay, well they're actually wearing white, and then she's in pink. It might be hard to see.
Yes.
Okay, so women are in dresses. Then they have the suit top. Both of these women, it's interesting, are wearing like a suit jacket, and then they've got like the skirt, and she's just, in her little dress. They're pearls, okay.
2 hats.
Okay, where are we seeing them?
The white one on the bottom left and the blue one on the top left.
Okay, the bisht, it's called, and the turban, okay.
The American and Russian contingents have the biggest smiles.
They're happy to be at the party. But standard of conformity, right? Even amongst those who are not necessarily in the Western dress, they're still in dark clothing. They've conformed to the group, and they're representing their tradition or ritual clothing just subtly on their heads.
Well, Morales is not there.
Pardon?
And for Morales is not there.
Well, this is from 2009.
Well,
so,
yes, I know, but I mean,
yeah.
he's a world leader that doesn't put a suit.
Yeah, that's true. And I think, but also the idea of head adornment is what associated with?
Western conceptions of the other.
Well, it's more of a royalty and kingship association. So the idea of distinguishing yourself with a head ornament, I mean, if I'm wearing a wreath or something of that nature, I mean, like, it's like leader, important, right? So there's that sense of distinguishment there. But what I think is most fascinating, my favorite fashion icon in the world is Castro, because it doesn't matter what goes down, he shows up in his like army fatigue style gear, right? He's like, I am ready for war. Like, you want to talk peace? I'm going to talk war. And so that idea of always wearing your military clothing, your formal engagement, battle clothing, it's an affront. It's like a sense of like, no, we're supposed to talk peace, because there's the theory that the tuxedo, for example, is used to level out, to make people equals, and the same with the suit, right? And so if you're distinguishing yourself and you're distinguishing in sort of an aggressive way, that's also the gesture of the punk, right? A punk clothing is like to distinguish yourself as aggressive. Then you're going to non-verbally communicate before you even speak, right, what your tone is. So, and that's important for Simmel's text as well. And then, yes, of course.
Would you also think that it's an aggressive, or say that it's an aggressive gesture for soldiers to be walking around in public in their military uniforms?
I mean, it's interesting, right, when you see them. I mean, what do you guys think? When you're at the airport and you see a bunch of people in fatigues or...
No, I'm not talking about fatigues as like a style choice. I'm talking about full...
No, I mean, yeah. Like, I mean, I've seen, at the airport, I've seen military people, and I'm saying I kind of feel uncomfortable, but yes?
Dustin probably experienced this as well. When people come back from their military duty and they go back to home for break or something, they're in their mililitary uniform sometimes. But they're not carrying a gun or something. They're probably on their phone talking to their girlfriend, and so they don't display an authority without some sort of means to do so. And so to me, what gives them the power or the appearance of power is simply their means of, I don't know, confronting me through a gun or something like that.
An accessory.
An accessory, an object. Okay.
And I think too, there's oftentimes there's a difference between like military dress wear and like actual battle wear.
The fatigues,
The fatigues, yeah. And I don't know, I always feel different if someone's like on the airplane with their dress uniform versus like fatigues. It communicates something very different, I think.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Definitely, for sure. Okay. Yes?
It's also like a form of like distinction. It's not so much that I don't really feel scared when I see people wearing those, like say like in an airplane or whatever, but it's almost like a thing so that people can recognize that they are, and then people say like thank you or whatever, and then they can give some form of like affirmation for whatever they're doing, but I think it's slightly different too than it's like a leader of a country who's then wearing like fatigues like that. There's a distinction, I think.
Well, I think it really depends on the context, because I was in Beirut, Lebanon recently, and there, at that time I was there, this presence of military people was quite disturbing, because it was a kind of conflict at that time, and so that's really a difference, I think.
Definitely, I mean, context is almost maybe everything in some ways when it comes to military and power positions, because, you know, if you can imagine, military are able to walk through any wall and cross any border in a way and be present and kind of represent their country wherever they go. But think of an American security guard or an American police officer walking in here, how much power would they have? We're in Switzerland, and so, you know, it's a different feeling, I think, as well. And that goes for a lot of uniforms, doctors, judges. There are all types of things that are very context-specific, and when they're taken out of their context, the meaning is shifted. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Martin said. I lived in Israel for a year, and I oftentimes had to go to Haifa, to Tel Aviv for work. And it was when the soldiers were going to wherever they were being deployed. So I'd be on a train with, it'd be 100 people in uniform, but they're all like 18, 19 years old. And so they've got guns, they've got everything, but at the same time you see this kind of immaturity, age, whatever. But on the other hand, you're crossing into Ramallah and you're being asked for your passport. It changes everything. But it is.
Yes. Well, a gun is really a weapon, right? More than it's an accessory. I think it can be worn as an accessory, but I mean, I think that for most of us, when we see a gun, like when you physically see a gun and it's in front of you and you pick it up and that thing is heavy and you are like, this is death, that you're not thinking about fashion or decoration. I think it's more of a different, it's a loaded gun is a different feeling. But yes, I think that's a good one. Yes.
Another example of kind of aggressive fashion in a social context. I was thinking of this when we talked about Steve Jobs and the way that he dresses. It seems like there's been a lot of ink spilled about Mark Zuckerberg's hoodie. And in the business world,
well, it's the
in the context of the corporate business world, I mean, it seems to really represent, and I think he means it to represent sort of belligerence toward traditional corporate culture.
Definitely. I mean, and I think Baudrillard, you know, I don't know those of you who've read his essay about jeans, that it's part of, it's not called jeans, but it's within one of his essays. I mean, you know, there's this sense of like, it is a fuck you, pardon my language, but you know, on some level, when there's a formal code anywhere, and someone just walks in, I mean, I don't know for those of you who went to an American prom, but you know, the guy that goes to the American prom with like his tuxedo jacket and shorts, and you're just like, no way, and he's like the rebel, you know? And there's that sense, like, where is the person who's disrupting the code? Where's the person that's shouting with their clothing, right? And it's not always the most obvious, it can be like under your hoodie. And the hoodie, of course, being aligned with like, sort of lower classes, maybe inner city, maybe it's even hip hop, like there's that too, that has that legacy, so that sense is a way to disrupt codes, I guess, yes.
But I think also, and especially with the example of Castro, the code has an aggressivity to it as well. There's, you know, and it's distributed and sort of less noticeable, but when everyone shows up to Suits, you know, to a meeting with Castro, there's kind of also an aggressivity that says, you know, you'll give in to the consensus, the international consensus that favors markets and these other things.
Right. Very good point, right? Because if you think about it, if we could just go back, I mean, are these guys meeting about politics or money? Because it looks like money, right? And you know, and whereas that looks like that's you know, there's political stuff to be done. So I mean, it is an interesting question. And then Sophia, did you have something to add?
Kind of.
Okay.
It's a little more anecdotal, but I teach at a high school, and with a lot of sort of artsy teenagers who want to express their individuality by shouting with their clothing. And I did too when I was a teenager, and I still do a little bit by wearing really glitzy jewelry. And we consistently run into this problem. We have this travel part of our our curriculum. And for instance, 2 years ago we were going to El Paso, and I had to bring a bunch of kids to a military base to interview soldiers, and so we sort of had to encourage the kids to dress up like kind of young Republicans. And then last year I brought a bunch of kids to visit Citizens United, like meet a bunch of Republicans and other, you know, really conservative people, and they're all my students are all in rags with their hair dyed, and I dress like this when I teach, you know, so I had to I was like, look, I'm straightening my hair, I'm taking off my earrings, I'm covering up my tattoos, like, I'm putting, you know, I'm dressing up in this drag in order to talk to these people, because they're not going to talk to us if we shout at them with our clothing. But it's it's really amazing how hard they fight back at me and the other faculty when we talk to them about, like, just about sort of like, not shouting with their clothing, so that we can you know, be non-aggressive in that way. And it's just sort of it's, you know, sort of part of the
disguise
way that teenagers do things, but it's but it's also, you know, definitely in terms of that this sort of tension between being an individual and also being, you know, they're trying to be also part of their own subculture by, you know, having their hair, by all having their hair in crazy ways and wearing all the same types of rags. And
there's a good way to explain that to the students that might resonate with adolescents, where if you can explicitly and directly kind of analogize and say that shouting with your clothing is like saying fuck you to mom and dad, then the dressed down Republican drag is like a very slowly unfurling middle finger.
Yeah.
And I mean, when I've had conversations with adolescents about that, it's like, oh yeah, cool, wait, that's actually, I can do that too.
Something similar to what I said.
Well, it prompts me to think about this idea of disguise, because it's like, I mean, you know, when you think about Castro in military clothing and how he's making it quite clear that he's not interested in talking about peace or growth. And then you think about the G20 and they're all in suits. I mean, you know, there might be a man there that so radically wants to take over the world and doesn't want to fuck everyone over, but he's wearing a suit because guess what? He wants everyone to like him and he's going to work through the system that way. So it's also possible to disconnect, I guess, which is what you're asking the teenagers. You're saying disconnect from yourself for a minute. Wear this and we'll accomplish what we need to accomplish. And so in some cases people disconnect from that communication, I guess. Yeah. So yes. Or either one of you guys.
I guess it's kind of related to this, but I know that politicians often learn how to power walk. You know, so they actually sort of have a different attitude to go with the clothing. So it's like it's a complete package.
Right. Well, there's also, I mean, there's tons of examples like corsets, for example. When a woman's wearing a corset, she's like sitting on her sitting bones, and she's like and she can barely breathe, and it's creating anxiety. So clothing also creates the energy we give off, right, and the way we communicate to people. So it's a good point. Okay, and then did you have something?
Yeah, I just want to bring up the idea that there can be a disconnect between the message sent out and the message received.
Oh,
the
definitely.
message that we create.
Definitely.
So we bring up the idea that Castro is trying to put out this very aggressive standpoint. He doesn't want peace, but really he might not actually be trying to send out that message. Really, he might be trying to communicate something else through what he's wearing.
Allegiance.
Or even, I mean, hairstyles can also do the same thing. Somebody might have, you know, dyed hair or doing something else with it, but they might not be trying to send out a code that is disrupting the system. They're just sending out something that they have, I don't know, they have any other message they're sending.
It's an excellent point, because we're talking from the lens of the sociologist, right? That's what I was trying to sort of start us out with, which is this, you know, the man with the surveillance camera who's like, these people do that, these people do that. But from an individual perspective, you're right. Like, we're not necessarily always coming up, like, we don't think everything I'm doing is against the masses. It might be for one person, it might be for ourselves. It's a good thing. Yes.
Yeah, I think what I got was really interesting out of Sophia's story is that this disconnect that the people at the military base don't even think about dyeing their hair to talk to us. Or like that there's no possibility that they might actually have to do something, which is the problem that I have with talking about Mark Zuckerberg, is of like having some sort of rebellious sort of business style.
Yeah.
We're totally fucked. if
Yeah.
that's the case.
You're right, on some level, that he's more strategic than we're assuming, we're giving him more power maybe than
Yeah, so we're
he's.
like, please do not talk about
Maybe
like
he's
that.
like, I don't want to get out of my pajamas, leave me alone, I want my ice cream. Who knows? Yeah, I mean, yeah, because it's assuming. Although, with Steve Jobs, I think it's different. And that was kind of the origin of our conversation, because Steve Jobs was very cautious about what he did and very specific about his clothes being uniform and consistent. And it wasn't, so maybe translating it to Mark is different, but, and I'm basing it on this Palo Alto essay, which, I mean, you can just search for it on Google, but it was pretty well known, this woman who wrote about this, who generalized, which again, I said that is a bit of a danger, but generalized that the transformation coming from Jobs was that we'll be casual and we'll do business, and that's how business is going to be done.
Right.
And whether it's specific to Mark or not, I don't know, but it's just kind of, that's how it is to be done. And it is whether Mark's knowing it or not, it is the fuck you to the larger system.
Yeah, to everybody.
To the whole, yeah, I mean, well. So, personal feelings aside, these are some images by Mario Testino. I do want to focus on fashion photography. Mario Testino, does anyone know who he is? He is the sort of, knighted photographer. He's not knighted yet, but of England. He did the portraits of, of course, the Prince and Kate, whatever. He did Princess Diana. He's like, the UK's most important photographer, so to speak, and he's a fashion photographer and a portraitist. And he did these photographs, if you can scroll through the palette, that'd be great, which are interesting because they kind of show this idea that we're talking about, right? Which is that there's a certain conformity and a uniformity amongst groups, whether they are, and those are the clothing codes that exist in groups, whether they're people in suits or whether it's sports or military, and then you have this distinction of style, which is aligned with fashion and usually aligned with women as well. Okay, and then also wanted to show, if we can just stop here, who's read Agamben's State of Exception? I hope some of you. It's an excellent book. Okay, so when Agamben's State of Exception came out in 2005, there was a photographer who we will be talking about in this class, very important, Stephen Meisel is his name, who, and can all of you read the titles, because I moved it. Can you guys see that on the bottom? You can. So, and Meisel never gives an interview. Really brilliant, and very much filmic in his editorials, and we're going to look at several of them over the next few days. But this one, which was called State of Emergency for Vogue Italia, was connected to this idea. He knew about Agamben's book, he knew the idea was kind of circulating consciousness, and he created this editorial, which is a fashion editorial, and which focuses on this clash between uniformity, and especially that idea of, like, if we're at the airport, what do we experience? Who's in uniform, who's not, right? Because when you're at the airport, you're in global territory. It doesn't matter what city you're in, every airport looks the same, roughly. And there's only one way to tell any difference between anyone. It's the people in charge and the people not in charge. The people who are going to decide if they're going to upgrade you to first class, or they're going to hassle you when you go through the gates or whatever. If you're flying commercial, you have to deal with this territory, right? And so you engage in this realm where there are people in civilian clothes and then there are people in uniform. And it's a power structure. And it doesn't matter what country you're from or what passport you have. And so that territory is different, right? And so he was exposing this and called it state of emergency, which is what? What's a state of emergency from Agamben's book?
It's the suspension of the law.
Yes. And so you get into the zone of an airport where you're in a state of emergency, right? And it's these people managing everything and this sort of exception. And you don't have the political figure, of course, that you do have in Agamben's analysis. But you can just scroll through these. Because Meisel he's selling fashion, right? Is he? I mean, it's interesting because the clothes are kind of distorted. But there's this sense, too, I feel every time I go through a commercial airport, I'm like, I'm being raped. I mean, I'm sorry, I know that's like a strong thing to say, especially as a woman, and it's not really, it doesn't maybe do justice to the experience of being raped, but I do feel like someone's searching my belongings, feeling my body, in that sense of where all of my private space is violated, except for my inner physical body. So, and they do cavity searches, people who know, so it is kind of very similar in some ways, but you can just keep going through these. And then it goes on to the street as well. So it's just a sense of a dramatic editorial. And Vogue Italia is a great place for these. They usually do these, people think, again, France is like the center of fashion, but Vogue Italia is the most progressive for its fashion photography editorials.
have a really
Okay, stop right here for 1 second. Yes.
I just have a really ignorant question
No
on
worries.
a practical level.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering in terms of the content of the images, the seeing, the idea, the topic that we're seeing.
Yes.
What is the process of that coming about to be? Is it the photographer who's saying, I want to
It's a great
do
question.
this? Or
Yes.
is it
So, okay, so this is a very unique instance. Vogue Italia has had Stephen Meisel do their covers for, I think it's been 25 years. We've just celebrated 25 years. So, Stephen Meisel is an exception to almost all, he's a state of exception to all rules in a way, because he's like a David Lynch of fashion photography. He shows up, he is in control of the situation. I've not talked to him personally, I know somebody that assisted him. It's a very methodical, it's a very overarching situation. He does have a stylist, but the stylist doesn't help him. So this is a unique situation. He's given carte blanche by the magazine and he does whatever he wants. And he has unlimited budgets and it's crazy. However, typically, a magazine will have an editorial number of pages. They will hire a photographer. That photographer, in some instances, will choose a stylist that they like, and the stylist is the person who then talks to the photographer and says, what's our story? Our story is, a boat on the lake. Okay, well, what do we need? Well, 5 sweaters. Oh, well, what about maybe a skirt and maybe overalls? And then they talk together and they come up with something. And then they go on set, and at that point, then they have the models and assistants and all the other people and carry it out.
so something like the Testino photographs that we
Would be an example, but he's pretty high up too. And so in some cases, like Testino has an entourage in the team that are with him all times. So he has his own person that's doing styling usually. He does work with a few accomplished stylists, but sometimes I would say it will be with the traditional formula, would be Testino, yeah. But Meisel is just everything he does is like a film, and he's more large scale. But in this case, so what was interesting is I think that there was this sense of this editorial, getting response from people that it was violating women, right? Because in all of the photographs, the women look really violated and really controlled by men. So when you flipped through the editorial in the magazine, when you got to the last few images, all of a sudden there were images of women with guns. And I remember thinking, this is so bizarre. It made no sense. It was all these images of these women against uniformed figures wearing fashion, and then in the end they're wearing these sexy black dresses and they're holding guns. So it was kind of an unusual sort of empowerment component to the editorial, and reversal, I guess, of the codes. Okay.
In terms of the established thinking, this is just the way it is.